Hey everyone, this is Nick Pineault and welcome to this Electrosmog Rx interview series. And today I have the honor of talking with none other than Dr. Jack Kruse, whom I met last weekend in Vermont at Nourish Vermont. Dr. Kruse is a respected neurosurgeon and CEO at Optimize Life, and a health and wellness company dedicated to helping patients avoid the healthcare burdens that we typically encounter as we age, and I need to add, with the wrong environment. He is a member of the American Association of Neurological Surgeons, the Congress of Neurologic Surgeons, and Age Management Medicine Group. Dr. Kruse, welcome to the interview series. Thanks so much for taking the time today.
Hey, no problem. Anytime, Nick.
Sure, and it was great hearing your talk. Unfortunately, I missed part of it because of the newborn, but I'll make sure to listen to the replay. You had, I think, 34 members that are your mitochondriacs, you call them, that are your fans and people who share a very unique perspective about health. Can you talk to health practitioners who are listening to this, have no idea what a mitochondriac is? Let's start there.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't call them my fans. I think these are people that have been disaffected both
Sure.
by functional medicine and allopathic medicine because most of the prescriptions that, we were taught in our training is not going to help people that are afflicted by mitochondrial diseases. And it turns out what you asked me to come on here and talk about and what you talked about in Vermont and what I actually talked about in Vermont was tangentially related to this EMF problem that we've developed. And the problem with EMF diseases, especially for practitioners, they don't understand the linkage between what was in their pathology book, in their biochemistry book, to what we're seeing clinically in the world today. And the problem is, if you try to understand this from a purely biologic or biochemical platform, you'll be wholly unsuccessful in doing so. And I think you even made the comment when you were on the stage that you need to really come at this probably from the biophysics or the physics angle. And unfortunately, most people that are involved in treating patients, they don't have a big physics background. So this is kind of like their big black box. So about 10 years ago, when I started to put my information online, I basically started to teach people everything you could possibly know about mitochondria. And the reason for this, it turns out your mitochondria is your sixth sense in your body. And it's the sense that deals with electrons and protons and photons. These are the things, that are tied to not only the universe, but also our sun, our communication devices, just pretty much everything we use. And the problem is in medical school or functional medicine training, nobody teaches people how a mitochondria really operates and how it connects into the pathways. So most people currently believe that glycolysis, the pentose phosphate pathway, the TCA cycle and urea cycle, they all work operationally in the cell all the time, and they're not dynamic. It turns out the dynamism comes from the biophysical levers, the light that is in our environment, and that's what actually changes the mix. And this is the reason why EMF has become what I call a big black box for most practitioners, because they don't really understand how different parts of the spectrum affects different parts of things in the cell to explain the symptoms that many patients have. And the other thing that really complicates things, and I mentioned this during your talk when I was in the back of the room, that when we get to 4G and 5G, it gets even more complicated because of the way electrical engineers are now changing waveforms. It's not just a strict power density issue anymore. Now you really have to know some of the interesting physics behind this to begin to understand it. And one of the things that I did in Vermont this year is I shared with people, especially my members know this, but most people who are not members don't. In 2003, I made predictions about what was going to happen when we went from a 0G to a 5G world. And almost all of the predictions so far have been spot on. And unfortunately, we happen to be talking on a day today where another prediction, unfortunately, was made that I said that suicides would absolutely go through the roof. Yeah. And, Anthony Bourdain killed himself and Kate Spade killed herself yesterday. And people don't understand how non-native EMFs, especially in a 5G city, can lead someone down this path. And I mentioned to somebody actually today when I was at work doing surgery that when Tesla and Edison came out in 1874, one built the light bulb, the other one built the power grid over the next 20 years, that if you really think about how Tesla went out, he went out very much the same way as Kate Spade and Bourdain, except he did it in a lot slower pace. The difference was the electromagnetic spectrum that he was around from 1870 to 1943 when he died is significantly different than the one that we face today. And back in 1874, the top 100 deaths in the United States, suicide wasn't even on the list. Today it's number 10. And when you actually contemplate that in 125 years, that we've got huge swings in what is hurting us. Like another one that I like to use in my talks is in 1900, the year 1900, the U.S. government, the 37th leading cause of cancer, which was already rare, was colon cancer. Today it's number 2 of all deaths. So if you believe in Darwin, you believe in natural selection, this clearly doesn't fit the paradigm that most of us were taught. And the reason for that is because people really don't understand how this scales directly to a cell. And what a mitochondriac is a person that takes the really hard stuff and decides they're not going to give up easy.
Yeah, and there's so much incredible things that leads me in all sorts of direction in what you just said. Let's talk. I think let's dive into 5G, because this is your talk. You talked about skin topology, and it turns out at the event, I don't know if you met him, but one electrical engineer from Poland called Pavel, and I'm connected with him. He's actually started a movement against, talking about EMFs in Krakow and getting cell towers out of the downtown areas. And turns out, I mentioned that in my talk, turns out it was in the room, a small world. And this guy told me, Nick, we need to chat further about the fact that power density, you shouldn't even talk about it in the 5G world. It does not matter, because other characteristics of the signal we need to look at. So does that mean that a building biology profession needs to adjust? Yes, of course. Yes. What's your take on it? How will 5G change everything? What exactly is
this
happening?
It's a great topic, because your book, I think when you gave it to me in Vermont, I read it on the plane home, and I finished it, and I think it's a great book from 0G to 4G. But I'm going to tell you, 5G is a game changer. And most people who are building biologists or EMF engineers that people are going to hire, they're really well versed on the power density story. But unfortunately, 5G is not a power density story. And it turns out the power density will be an issue, but it's not the major one, especially for clinicians to worry about. So I think where we have to start first before we get into the 5G.
Sure.
So I think clinicians need to know that the power grid is not the same everywhere in the world. That's issue number one. And why is this a big deal? Well, in Europe, it oscillates at 50 hertz. Here in North America, it's 60 hertz. Why is that a big deal? It turns out the two major biochemical programs in our body, TCA cycle and urea cycle, only operate when the intermitochondrial membrane is oscillating at 100 hertz. So I just told you, in Europe, the reason why we're starting to see way more people with electro hypersensitivity is this reason, because it's the second harmonic. So practitioners in Europe need to be very well aware of this. Or if people are taking care of people here in the States that are coming from Europe, like I do, you need to be very aware. That's issue number one. That's going to be the same whether it's 4G, 5G, or 6G. Now, where the 5G changes things, it's most people don't know what topology even means. And I would strongly recommend anybody who's listening to this talk, go Google the 2016 Nobel Prize in Physics, because that's what it was given for. And basically what it is anything that happens on the surface changes everything that happens deep within the structure. And it actually can change the physical barrier of what's on the surface. And it turns out that in physics, many people right now have found out about topology from this very interesting I guess you could call it an isotope of carbon, but it's really a form of carbon that's a crystal. It's called graphene. And graphene is where we started to see all these weird things. And graphene is 100% made out of carbon, and we're 100% made out of carbon. It turns out that nature has also used topology in us. We actually are filled with topologic insulators. Well, 5G is going to affect our surfaces. So when I talk to clinicians and patients, the surfaces that we're all interested in are the skin, the eye, the gut, and the lung. Why? Because those are the areas that interact with the environment. That's where the non-native EMF is going to be, especially from 5G. So the way normal EMF works in the environment, when the sun hits our skin, that happens between 250 and 780 nanometers. Well, 5G is going to occur all the way from 3 gigahertz all the way up to 90 gigahertz. So the range is massive, okay? But the key is when sunlight hits us, it knocks an electron out of one of our lipids, our water, or our fats, our carbohydrates in our skin. And that creates a hole. And that hole is called a quasi-particle. But what it does, the electron has a negative charge, but the hole that it leaves behind is a positive charge. It turns out you can change what a substance physically is by putting holes in different places, being strategic, and it turns out that's what sunlight really does for us. And there is a program based in sunlight that does this, and it turns out that our optical window, meaning that our tissues, our skin, the things below our skin, are all optimized for this one octave within the electromagnetic spectrum. Well, 5G completely changes that, because what does it do? It affects the electrical capabilities of surfaces. And the reason why physicists are so interested in this, because they now know that they can use graphene to shrink semiconductors even further. So that means they can save energy and power through all these different aspects. But what people do not realize is that the base for graphene and us, if you use it in a biosensor, that 5G information can be downloaded to you even faster to cause more disruption. For example, if you put a graphene sensor, say, when you're in the ICU, since you have, say, a brain tumor, it may turn out that the 5G could jump conduct into that sensor and go straight into your body and cause radical changes right there when you're in the hospital. And the doctors who are taking care of you will absolutely have no clue that this is actually going on. Why? Because they don't understand the physics. And one of the things I said when you gave your talk at the back of the room, I said, I'm actually optimistic about 5G. And I think that shocked a lot of people in the room, because I think it's going to be so obvious that there's a problem. ERs, doctors' offices, people are going to start coming down with the most bizarre things. It's going to be really weird, and it's going to happen like this. And one of the things that people may not believe that I'm going to say right now, because it's a very hot topic, especially in some of the internet groups that I saw this morning. This opiate crisis, this suicide crisis we have, this has come up literally in the last 2 or 3 years. Well, what changed in the last 2 or 3 years? We went from 3G to 4G. Now we have 5G testing during 4G world, and people don't realize this is why Carrie Fisher had her heart attack on the plane. If you look at the things that are happening, plane is a metal tube filled with 250 obedient idiots all using Wi-Fi at the same time. So technically the people in the plane are the microwave steak. But we don't realize that we should start to see bizarre behavior. Remember the people that get into fights on plane, or when they pulled the doctor off the plane last year because, the bizarre behavior. Well, people don't put these things together, that these are non-native EMF effects, and they are. And what my point was to you in Vermont was that I want people to pay attention to the aberrant health consequences, because this is going to be your biggest clue that the area that you live in right now, that zip code, is a problem. And here's the real problem that I'm concerned with 5G. Because the range goes from 3 gigahertz to 90 gigahertz, what happens in Montreal is not going to be equivalent to what happens in New Orleans. And the reason for that, the way the 5G network has to be built, if you happen to be in an area where there's a lot of trees, it's going to be extremely difficult to get a 5G signal to you. So you'll see what's going on right now in England. They're cutting all these trees down that are 400 and 500 years old to make it so that people can get their Netflix faster. So if you start to see, power companies, cable companies cutting trees down in an area that's densely wooded, that's a clue to you what's coming. When you start to see different antennas going around, for example, one of my members, Matt Maruka, who runs the Raw Optics thing, he's out in California. He just sent me pictures last night on the Pacific Coast Highway of the new 5G antennas, literally in the middle of where nobody is, going all the way up and down the whole coast of California. They're there. They're already there, and they're testing them, and they're operational. And if you don't believe it, this is one of the things I said to you also in Vermont. Why is this a really devastating thing for patients and for practitioners like myself? Well, to get a trimeter or say an RF Cornet device, like most people learn about when they read your book, you can't do that with 5G. The reason why? There's no 5G testers out unless you're willing to spend $120,000. That was the point that I made in the back of the room in Vermont. And believe it or not, Verizon, AT&T, I talk to their guys all the time because they come to see me because the linemen are very worried about their own medical conditions. They're no longer allowed to carry meters to check the electromagnetic fields they operate in. Several of these guys have to wear Faraday cages to install the 5G in cities around the area. So when you begin to realize the real problem here, and you happen to see these things happening in your neighborhood. So for example, the people listening to this who are in the Austin, Texas area or the Los Angeles area, you need to pay big attention. Why? Because 5G is already there. If you're in Denver or Colorado Springs, practitioners in that area need to realize when they start to see, ridiculous cases of adrenal fatigue or leaky gut or, things that most allopathic docs would say, oh, that's not realistic. You need to realize the cause of that is actually from the circadian disruption on every peripheral clock gene. It's not most of the stuff that you're going to hear about, at the functional medicine academies and in medical school. And that's what I need to get people to understand, because I tell people this all the time, and it gets me in trouble with people. If you can't explain the science, in my opinion, it's pseudoscience. You have to be able to understand and explain the science to somebody in a room of people who ask you coherent questions so that they understand what they're facing. Because guess what? If you're a treating physician or a treating practitioner and you're not able to answer the patient's questions or have no clue why they're having these bizarre symptoms that they are, I mean, effectively, you're no different than some guy on the internet that they're getting their answers from.
Yeah, this is profound. And this is, I'm some guy on the internet and I'm trying to get the word out. And then next thing I know, getting this course off the ground, I have people like Dr. Tom O'Brien and the top authorities that say, hey, Nick, teach me about EMFs. And I'm a bit overwhelmed, Jack, because I shouldn't be teaching you about these things. It's so critical, and yet I have, as a citizen, a journalist, to take this information and get it to the public. And thanks so much for being here, because about 5G, I think it's profound to say that everything that's going to be taught in this course in cities that 5G is in cannot be applied the same. Everything changes. And one thing you mentioned is jump conductance. Can you talk a little bit about that? Let's say I have 5G antennas. One person I know, Jody, who's a health practitioner, woke up a morning and she sees this 5G antenna. It's up. And no warning, right? So what happens now that the 5G antenna is there is, if I understand that correctly, is that 5G jumps all over the wiring in your house. Can you address that a little bit?
Well, not only does it jump on the wiring, it jumps on the water lines, the gas lines.
Yeah.
The crazy part, when they tested the 5G in New York City, I happen to have two members who are laser physicists that own a company that puts all the fiber optics in the ground in the entire Northeast, including Montreal. Wow. So I know a lot about what's going on in the world. And when they first tested this 5G in Midtown Manhattan, within 2 weeks, they had 5 people get electrocuted from standing on a manhole cover and also leaning on the lampposts that are in the city. Because what the city originally did is they started to put the 5G antennas on lampposts, traffic lights, and on Park Avenue on the outside of buildings. So for every city block in New York, you had to have 3 RF microwave repeaters in order to get the signal strong enough. What they started to find very quickly is that when they did this, they electrified any conductor that was around. So they had problems with the cable and the power grid in the apartments on Fifth Avenue. You know, rich people, they don't like it when things start to go awry. And Con Edison started to get complaints that people were getting static electric shocks. There was even reports of people driving down Park Avenue also getting shocks when they just touched their cell phone. And this brings up another kind of scary point. The other big thing that happened when they tested 5G in Southern California, and a lot of people call this conspiracy theory until you physically look in it, all the antennas that were in the Santa Rosa area, they were all turned on right before the Santa Rosa fires last October. And guess what? PG&E, which is the Con Edison version out in Southern California, reported 2 to 3 days before full power went on that they had massive changes within the power grid. And you can go look this. This is public data. You're a journalist, so you can go pull this up. Well, it turns out everybody knows when they put on the news that 2 or 3 days later, we saw these massive wildfires that did the most bizarre things. They would melt car engines, but the trees that were around weren't touched. And the reason for that is the trees were grounded. Anything that wasn't grounded that had a conductor in it had the temperature that would approach that to melt aluminum. And we actually saw, $100,000 cars with aluminum engine blocks melted in the street while the trees around their incinerated house were not bad. That is the absolute electromagnetic footprint of an electromagnetic fire. So guess what? These things that we're talking about, these are the clues that the people who watch this video need to begin to remember. It's okay that you think this is hyperbole or it's going to suspend your belief. That's not the point. The point is you need to be aware, because you don't understand the science, that these kind of things can happen. So then let's take it to the next step. Because your focus is to teach practitioners, they need to understand then how these things will affect biology. And that's where becoming a mitochondriac becomes incredibly important. Why? Because it turns out the way the inner mitochondrial membrane, the ATPase, the outer mitochondrial membrane operate with or within our 1 octave of the electromagnetic spectrum, you need to be an expert of that to understand the abnormal that is going to come with 3G, with 4G and 5G. So that way when patients come to your door, you're not going to be foolish like most functional medicine doctors are and order $3,000 worth of labs that are not going to help. Believe it or not, as I said from the stage in my talk, that some of the basic labs that one gets will give you a clue of what's really going on, so that way you'll know what questions to ask. And that's, to me, the most important part of this story, both on your end as a journalist and my end as a physician, is that we have to teach people coherently exactly what to look for, what not to look for, what to focus your attention on, and really to be a good listener and observer. Because, believe it or not, watching the news, watching the things that go on in current events are going to clue you in when something's changed in your own environment.
What are these tests, Jack, that you would recommend? I guess it's, I've heard with Zach Bush talks about, what is it called? Phase angle. Is that a good one? Which test would you look at to see how electromagnetic and the light environment is wrong in someone?
Yeah, these are all tests that actually most people can do without a doctor. And that's part of the reason why allopathic doctors and functional medicine doctors, really at some level, I think they're very uncomfortable with many of the things that I'm teaching people, because you don't really need a doctor to actually understand this until things really go awry. The simplest test is a BUN and creatinine ratio. What does BUN stand for? Blood urea nitrogen. What did I say to you earlier, Nick? The 2 key things that separate us, meaning humans, from our evolutionary ancestors is the TCA cycle and urea cycle. Urea cycle is linked to BUN. What does that mean? When your BUN goes up, your urea cycle is not working. That means those 2 cycles, which are like bicycle tires, one of them is not working as good. So your BUN rises. What is that a sign of? It's a sign that the cell is dehydrated inside. Very similar to the story that I gave you before about the 250 obedient idiots in the plane flying from Montreal to New Orleans. Why? Because they're being irradiated just like a piece of steak in a microwave oven. Well, it turns out, how does this physically happen now at the cell level? Well, the BUN goes up. When the BUN goes up, water can't be added to either of those cycles. One of the gentlemen that spoke at Vermont right before me, which is Dr. Boros, he tried to get that message across. Unfortunately, many of the people that were there don't have the biochemical background to really, truly understand this. And there may be many people watching this that also don't know. But here's the beautiful part of being a mitochondriac. You don't need to know all the steps in the TCA cycle. All you need to know is this, that you cannot fat burn and you cannot use protein properly if those two cycles aren't working. So what is this a story of? The kinetics of those two cycles. So I tell people to think about it like a Ferrari. If the Ferrari has Aunt Jemima syrup in it, it can't spin as fast. So what do you see? You see the BUN goes up and the creatinine ratio goes up. Generally, if it's above 15:1, you know the environment that you're in is not good, okay? What's another test? This is probably the best one, and this is one that will probably resonate with a lot of the clinicians that you're going to have here. I hear every time I go talk, the number one question they want to ask me is, hey, Jack, I put people on a boatload of vitamin D, then I check it in 3 months and it hasn't budged. Why is that? Well, it's very simple. That tells you that the environment that they're living in is very high-powered 4G, probably got 5G in it. Why? Turns out on the surface of your skin, back to the topology story, when the sunlight hits your skin, your mitochondria make water. Well, it turns out the way we make vitamin D3 is from LDL cholesterol converting to D3, and it begins on our skin. That's called an isomerization step. If you have no water in your skin, you can't make the conversion. So guess what? That's the reason you never see it. That's the topology effect that occurs on the skin. Most functional medicine doctors don't know that. I can tell you most allopathic doctors don't know that, with the exception of dermatologists. The dermatologists do know about that isomerization step, but they believe the sun causes the problem. They have no idea how mitochondria work, so they never get the story fully correct either. The key is patients, though, know, especially patients that have other comorbid mitochondrial disease, they have this problem. So the classic one that you hear about in many conferences you go to is the fat person that takes vitamin D and it never goes up and they can never lose weight. Well, it turns out the reason is that they're in an environment that's loaded with non-native EMF. The most common one is blue light. The second most common one is the networks that they're around, because it turns out that the mechanism of this effect body-wide is what I talked about in Vermont. It's where melanopsin, the blue light detector in your eye and your skin, is bound to vitamin A. In us, in humans, it's a loose covalent bond, meaning that it's very easy to break. That's the reason why it's a problem, because when vitamin A goes down, guess what it's yoked to in the brain? Vitamin D. Vitamin A and vitamin D are linked. Why? Vitamin D is a skin product. Vitamin A is a brain product. What do the skin and the brain have in common for the doctors listening to this? They both come from neuroectoderm. That's the reason why vitamin A and vitamin D are yoked. So when vitamin A goes down for a reason that's not tied to nature, namely blue light from man or his networks, vitamin A crashes, that causes circadian disruption. And that means that vitamin D doesn't act the way it should. So there's your other test that you can use as a base test. And you know that test, you can go to anylabstestnow.com as a patient, draw it yourself for $16 and you got the answer. So if you have those two, that's a big one. What's the third test that you can use? Well, I told you that circadian disruption is the key to understanding this big deal. So what's the easiest one? Here's where the functional medicine doctors have it above the allopathic doctors. Getting an adrenal stress index. That's when you measure your cortisol, your DHEA, and your melatonin level. Why is that important? Because that gives the patient and the clinician an idea of exactly what's going on in the hormone panels. And most people don't realize that the way we make our hormones naturally in our body is through the sun, but the physical pathway is we get to this steroid called pregnenolone. Pregnenolone comes from LDL cholesterol, just like vitamin D does. Well, LDL cholesterol, to get the pregnenolone, guess what it needs, Nick? It needs a thyroid hormone called T3 and it needs vitamin A. What did we just say about non-native EMF, blue light, and 5G? You don't have any vitamin A. So guess what it means? You can't make all the sex steroid hormones. That's the reason why everybody's sex steroid hormones are crashed. And DHEA is right in the middle of that panel. So that's the reason why you want to use that one, because it gives you an idea of how bad the effect is, okay? The wrong answer is to take somebody with a trashed hormone panel and then start giving them bioidentical hormones, because what did you physically do then? You lose the ability to understand how bad that environment really is for the patient. Because this is the other part of the story. When the clinician gets this story down, this is the reason why your building biologists that you wrote about in your book and your EMF engineers need to understand what me and Nick are talking about now. Because if you're going to hire them, you actually have to have them talk to your clinician so that they're talking the same language. You can't be like Apple and Microsoft, staring apart. And I have to tell you, one of the things that I'm concerned about when people read your book, that they're going to assume the building biologist knows about this whole melanopsin thing. Don't, because none of them do. Most doctors don't know about it. That's the reason why I've been teaching my people this for 10 years. And when you begin to understand how the pieces fit, because you see them fall apart, the tests that I just recommend to you are the easiest ways on a base level for you to understand how they're falling apart. Then what to do about them in terms of the mitigation, that's when the story changes, because what most of the functional medicine docs and allopathic docs tell people is radically different than what I tell people, because my perspective is wholly based on mitochondrial biology, because that's what I'm an expert in.
And just to be clear, that we're talking about 25 OHD for the test. For the vitamin. Okay. And what levels do you, like, there are certain schools of thought, 30 to 50, some other people like 50 to 70 or plus. Where do you stand?
You know what the toxic level is based on the literature? 250 nanograms per deciliter. So my belief is that if you are an equatorial person, like the people that Jeff Leach were talking about in Vermont, 150 to 200 nanograms per deciliter from the sun. Oh my God.
Okay.
So a guy like you, where you are in Montreal at the 45th latitude, right now, 3 weeks before the summer solstice, I want you 60 to 80. I guarantee you, if we check you right now, you're not going to make it there. Why? Because you're too much indoor. You're an indoor silly talking monkey, which is what I told people. And today, like when I was doing surgery in between my cases, I actually was outside with basically a Kaniki on in between my cases. Now, I'm at the 28th latitude today. It's 95 degrees. UV index is like 14. So I was out there for a total of 2 hours in between my cases. So I'm going to tell you, your latitude and altitude play a huge role. But one of the things that I made a comment when you gave your talk, because you asked this question, and I really want to get this here because I hope you begin to talk about this with your people. The single number one most important test for everybody is population density. So that means the more idiots you have around you, the more you need to be concerned as a journalist, as a non-native EMF engineer, as a building biologist, as a patient, as a clinician. So for example, if somebody comes to you from Regina, Saskatchewan versus downtown Toronto, you can almost guarantee the person from Toronto is going to have a huge problem. And you need to know what to look for, because here's the flip side. The inconvenient truth from understanding how non-native EMF really works is you may get to the point after doing all your testing, doing your hacks with your building biologist, doing your hacks with the electrical engineers, saying, you know what, I can't stay here anymore based on my redox potential, because even if I'm naked outside in Montreal or Toronto, I can't get my vitamin D. I can't recover these things because my topology is so demolished. Now, this is a very inconvenient thing for me to tell people. But one of the things I said in Vermont that I want to share with you, because I'm assuming you were probably out of the room when I said it, because it models directly to nature. And I think when people understand it, they'll understand what I just said is very congruent with nature. So I'm going to teach you something about Africa, the wildebeest. How did the wildebeest, there's only 2 seasons on the equator, okay, wet and dry season. How did the wildebeest, who have no smart brains in their head, know to go migrate across the Nile River to get to the other side where the grass is better? Well, it turns out the way grass grows by photosynthesis there's an isotope of hydrogen in the grass called deuterium. That deuterium aggravates their enterocytes in their gut. They get a little bellyache, and that tells them the grass is no more good. Okay? They're paying attention to the sun as well, so they know that the season's changing. That gets them to go across the Nile River to migrate to get to where the good grass is. Now, they have to go past those 20-foot crocodiles, so several of the wildebeest are going to get taken out by nature. But guess what? Millions, and this is the biggest migration every year on Earth, have to make this trek in order to survive. So the thing that I just told you before, that you may begin to realize that you can't stay in Montreal. You can't stay in Toronto. You can't stay in New Orleans. People on the internet don't like my message because they want to do what they want to do. And what I'm trying to explain to people is that exactly what happens in the wildebeest through nature's seasonal change of its EMF is exactly what we're creating ourselves, and we don't realize it. And we need to realize it, because guess what? The physical change that occurred in that wildebeest stomach, that is topology change of the gut surface. That's exactly what happens with seasons. And that was the reason I made the point that I made from the stage about Jeff's talk and about Zach's talk, that I don't think many of the people in the functional medicine world or in Zach's world understand truly how the microbiome and the gut work. And the reason why this is very important, you're doing this seminar series, is that we need to get this message out to people that they need to start to think about things a little bit more differently and with a different perspective. Because if you think taking a probiotic or eating fermentable carbohydrate fibers is going to solve a quantum EMF problem, you cannot be part of my tribe. It is absolutely incongruent because it doesn't make any sense to the physics involved.
Well, it's merely a patch to the wrong environment. That's the way I see it. I mean, now you're really making my head spin here, because it's now I'm starting to put things together, Jack. In a sense, you're in Montreal, and the electrosmog is, I don't know, I'm getting in my bedroom 0.2 volts per meter. That's high. Like, right. I cannot avoid that unless I don't know, I fly out Brian Hoyer here and kind of shield the entire thing. And even then, when I'm not in the bedroom, I'll be exposed to these EMFs, and it's changing my skin topology, my ability to absorb vitamin D. So even if I stand naked outside, I got a balcony on top. I was there for an hour today. I got a tan. That might be extremely insufficient. And correct. Even as time goes by, if 5G is installed in Montreal, then I'm doing nothing for my biology. So then if disease starts stacking...
This is important for you to get. I'm glad you're getting it.
Yeah.
Because now you can get a tan, your vitamin D still can be low, and your redox be horrible. This is what people don't understand. And this is the reason why you saw me in my talk in Vermont, where I was passionate from the stage when I said, look, what Jeff Leach just told this entire audience, and I'll be honest with you, Nick, I think it went over everybody's head. He basically told you that the Hazda could eat shit on a shingle, have antibiotics, and never get sick. Do you know why? Their redox is through the roof because they live on the equator. But then we had another speaker tell people, oh, take my product when they live in Virginia. Well, guess what? You know the reason why? Because the amount of non-native EMF that the people that Zach sees are not equivalent to the Hazda. They're just like the realization you just had that said, oh my, if I don't fix this, nothing is going to fix it. And you're right, it is a patch. And that's what I've been trying to teach people for 10 years. And the reason why I'm optimistic, much more than I've ever been in my life, is because 10 years ago, I was crazy. And every year I get less and less crazy, because guess what? People are beginning to understand what I'm physically saying. Guess what? The data, the predictions that I've made for 15 years are now starting to come true. And nobody else has an answer why kids are shooting people in school, why people are killing themselves, why autoimmunity, like for example, Hashimoto's went from 1% in 1986 to 99% of hypothyroid cases now. I'm telling you, it's related to this change in topology as we have changed the EMF seasons that we live in. The seasons we live in now are no longer, spring, summer, winter, and fall. They really are different. And the craziest part of this story, to really hammer home here, Nick, is, and this is one of my big concerns with 5G, and I hope you really start writing a lot more about this and talking to people about it, is that the 5G effects in different cities are going to be wildly different. And we need people to understand that, because the recipe that Verizon's going to use in one city has to be different than other cities. And that's never been true from 0G to 4G, but in 5G, that's the case. And you know what that's going to mean? It's going to create really abnormal studies, which is going to benefit the cell companies, but it's really going to confuse doctors, because it's going to say, well, why does this guy from Providence, Rhode Island have this, but this guy from Southern California have that? Like when, say, we have a meeting of clinicians, say at a functional medicine meeting, people are going to get confused. And then what are they going to do when they're confused? They start ordering things or doing things that make no sense. And guess what happens? Patients don't get better. They actually get worse. This is the reason why I have been adamant about teaching people physics. And what have everybody told me? Jack, this stuff is too hard to teach people. I'm like, look, when you see what's coming, you're not going to have a choice. If you're not willing to do the heavy lifting of learning a little bit of physics, guess what? You're going to be as smart as your doctor that knows nothing about physics. And see, I don't put the blame on doctors or even on functional medicine doctors. I do get aggravated with some of them that are selling people patches, same thing with supplement makers, because they have not been willing to go all in and really learn what you're trying to teach people. So you're trying to do it from the journalism side. I'm trying to get people who are practitioners to understand they need to understand some of the basic physics. That way, they become way better clinicians, and they will stop doing things that make no difference to patients and start doing things that do make a huge difference to patients, because many of them are very counterintuitive. And the reason they're counterintuitive is because light is counterintuitive. And that's what EMF is all about. It's a light story, and you need to become a light expert, not a food guru.
Let's talk about light. And one thing you recommend your members, and you've been recommend that for years, is going and flying off to Mexico or to a location with an extremely high UV index to kind of charge up with the sun. Is that something I recommend to practitioners? And that's something that for electro hypersensitivity to kind of to detect if someone is EMF sensitive, whatever that means. Honestly, it doesn't mean anything.
Well, I will tell you a story. I kind of wish you would have talked to one of my members when you're in Vermont, because you would appreciate this. Her name is Sarah Hogton. I met her in 2015 at a biohacking event in London. This lady has to live almost an hour and a half outside of London, and she runs one of the big companies in London. So she's a pretty important person. She picked me up from Heathrow Airport, and she had a brand new, at the time, Jaguar. The entire dashboard was pulled out. All the wires are disconnected. And I was with one of my friends who was going to speak with me at the event. And we invited her to come to have lunch with us in central London. She goes, guys, I can only spend 1 hour before everything goes crazy. So, of course, the event was the next day. And Jeremy looked at me, that's my friend, and he goes, is this for real? I'm like, oh, yeah, it's for real. And we talked about it for the next 2 or 3 days. This is 2015. So at the end of the event, and Sarah by the end of the event was pretty frazzled because she was there, I made this prediction, Nick. I said, Sarah, if I can get you on a plane to come to Playa del Carmen, I'll bet you within 3 weeks, every single one of your symptoms goes away. And she looked at me and she goes, Jack, I've been all over the world. I've seen doctors everywhere. She goes, there's no way. And I said, I'm going to teach you something, because you won't believe me if I teach you the physics. You physically have to experience it to see. So my member event was 6 months later in Playa del Carmen. And she came, and the first thing she did before the event started, she came 3 days, decided to stay in the jungle with the Mexican Indians that are there. So for 3 days, she came to the resort that has EMF, 2G, 3G, deck phones, all the bad stuff, no symptoms at all. Not one. 3 days it went away. I predicted it would take 3 weeks. Now, what's the reason that Playa del Carmen is special? You have to understand mitochondria. Turns out it's not just the high UV index, because guess what? We can move everybody to the equator and they can get better. That's not the total answer. There's another thing about Playa del Carmen that's unique. This is where the asteroid hit the planet that wiped out dinosaurs and where our clade came from, the eukaryotes. That hole in the ground is 166 miles wide. It's a huge deep hole. The rim goes from the Isle of Mujeres all the way to Progreso. That's the only part of the crater. About 13% is above ground. The rest of it is in the Gulf of Mexico. Why is this important for you to understand? That brings you closer to the magma chamber. For example, people watching this probably have seen all the stuff about Guatemala and about Hawaii and see the lava. Well, guess what? That means under this part of the world, the magma chamber is much closer. It's a dynamo. It's flowing metal. What does that mean? The magnetic field is higher. What does that mean, Nick? It means the ATPase in every mitochondria of your body, without any input from the sun, spins faster.
You're recharging the batteries, literally.
Exactly right. And guess what else happens there? All the water from the Yucatan Peninsula comes from the cenotes. What are the cenotes? This is the rim of the crater pushed up. It's all limestone from the base of the ocean. And after 65 million years, the water goes in there and makes these holes, and they collapse. All that's filled with 65 million year rainwater that's deuterium depleted because of the calcium carbonate that it's in. So what does that do? It makes the ATPase spin even faster. Then the third issue is at the 20th latitude north. So guess what? It's the tropics. It's not as good as the equator, but it doesn't have to be. Why? Because it's good enough. Because when you take those three things that I call the three-legged stool, it is the best place on planet Earth for you to come when you have bad mitochondria to see how bad your effect really is, and for you to understand that you do need to know a little bit about the physics. So when Sarah came on faith alone, and I told her this, she's now become one of my, how shall I say, my starfish that teaches people all over Europe exactly what electrohypersensitivity is. Basically, it's those TCA and urea cycles and the ATPase, they don't spin as fast. That's all you have to know about biochemistry. Now, if you want to know deeper, I'll teach you that. But that's really all you need to know. And that's what electrohypersensitivity fundamentally is. And what does that mean when you're a human? Well, we have this big neocortex and the big heart where all our mitochondria are. So that means you have to use the two older evolutionary pathways, which everybody knows, glycolysis and the PPP, which is the pentose phosphate pathway. Those two pathways are designed to work with low oxygen levels to keep growth down. That's the reason why people have brain fog. Why? Because your brain has more mitochondrial density than any organ in your body. So when you're afflicted by non-native EMF allergies or topology, however you want to call it, this is the reason why your tissues with the highest mitochondrial density go south fastest. And that's the key. The ones that don't are the ones that are not loaded with mitochondria. And can we see the effects of mitochondria or topology disease? Here's another test that I use that I talk about on my Patreon blog. You'll probably appreciate this because I think it's something that each one of your practitioners probably learned in medical school and forgot. If you do a blood smear on yourself, just take some blood out, put it on a slide and smear it, look under there, you're going to see some weird looking cells. And those cells manifest when you're afflicted by non-native EMF. The red blood cells have these spiked borders on. You should never see them. You will see those in there. So guess what? A simple blood smear, which, Nick, honestly, only the cost is a glass slide and the microscope. You're talking, if a practitioner does this, maybe cost them $300 a year and they could do this for all these people. I personally teach my members how to do this themselves. So that way they'll know, because my belief is when you know better, you do better. So there's many different ways to skin this cat. There's plenty of other ways, but these are the easiest ones for people to be listening so that when 5G, you hear it's coming in your neighborhood from the local news or the paper, you begin to start to pay attention to these things. I want everybody to really pay attention when you're at church, when you're in the grocery store, when you're talking all the gossip around. That gossip is going to be tied to people beginning to get sick from this problem. And you, as the smart clinician, have a duty to pay attention to that. Because guess what? This isn't going to show up in the CDC statistics. It's not going to show up here. It's going to show up on social networks like we're on online, where you start to hear, hey, Nick Pineault saying everybody in Montreal is starting to come down with CML or CLL and nobody knows why. Or why is it that northern New Jersey and southern California have this huge spike in autism, but that's not present in Salinas, Kansas? this is the key. And see, hospitals, and I mentioned this in your talk, hospitals already are beginning to realize that certain zip codes get certain diseases. For example, we know in most hospitals, there are certain parts of cities that those people who live in that area tend to spend more time in the ICU. How do you like that? Well, guess what? All it takes is an investigative journalist like yourself to start to look at, okay, let's look at that zip code and see how it's different from a non-native EMF perspective. Let me tell you something, Nick. Here's your homework. You can go then and start giving that to journalists and to politicians and saying, look at how the health metrics and the EMF metrics marry completely up. It's going to be really, really difficult for people to argue with that. And I can tell you, guys like Sam Milhelm, the epidemiologist, when you start to communicate with them, you're going to make clinicians that we're trying to help their job much easier. That is really where I view your job, where I view epidemiologists, is the bridge between clinicians and patients. Why? Because let's face it, some patients, they don't want to do the heavy lifting. I mean, I can tell you, my people, I actively, and you know this, I can be pretty aggressive with my attitude and how I do things, but I think you're beginning to understand why. I want the people that are all in. I'm not interested in people who want to be spoon-fed or go through the drive-through for someone to teach them this. Why? To truly understand this, you have to have skin in the game.
Wow, so much. Like I don't even know what to add. I'm gonna ask you a couple of rapid fire questions from the audience. I asked around, okay, what should I ask Jack Kruse when it comes to EMFs? Electromagnetic shielded clothing.
No.
And that's because, especially in a 5G world, is that right?
Right, because it's jump conduction, and here's the problem. This is the way you have to look at it. Anything that you decide to use on your body, you have to personally vet. Do not listen to any marketer, supplement maker, doctor, or anybody else. Why? Because your mitochondria and your life is at risk. So I'm going to make it very simple for people, because most people know that I'm building a facility down here about 5G mitigation. Let me tell you what I found. You want to build the best place that you can and have a house, reinforced concrete with rebar in it. The walls need to be sheetrock with lead line, just like we do in a hospital when we're building an MRI or a radiology suite. Why? That's how powerful 5G is. Why? Anything else you use, it'll go right through, or it'll cause jump conduction. The other thing I'm a big fan of, metal roofs. Why? What's the big change? And we mentioned this in your talk in Vermont. If you would have talked to me a year ago, I would have said, no, mitigation's different. This is the key for people to understand. You have to live a life where you're dynamic. As the information changes, you have to change. So now we know in the United States, at least, and I'm sure Canada is going to be the same way, most of our 5G probably in the next year or two are going to come from above, from satellites. So that means the number one thing is you need to start thinking about metal roofs and metal walls, or some kind of metal reinforcement in your walls to block it. Inside that, you can put new metal lining. Most commercial electricians know, like when they build a hospital, everything has to have new metal wiring. So that's simple to do. It'll add about 20% of the cost to rewire a house. But if you're smart, and this is the key, if you're smart right now, sell your old house in the next 2 or 3 years. Why? Because then you're going to want to start building the smart way. That's exactly what I'm doing. In fact, one of my members is actually starting a company in the UK to build, it's called Da Vinci Houses. Why? It's built with non-native EMF involved. Everything about the house is tied to this. So when we can put builders in this mix, guess what? They'll be talking in unison with building biologists and electrical engineers to help us all. But you have to help yourself by realizing that there's things that you can do that change the way you go. Like if you say, look, I own this house and I'm not going to change this and I'm not going to do that and do this, then fine. Just deal with going to the NHS or going to, public healthcare in Canada, because you're going to get sick. It's just, that's the way it's going to be. And you're going to see a bunch of doctors that have no clue what's going on with you. And this is the reason why you heard me passionately from the back of the room in Vermont when people were saying we need grassroots efforts. No, we don't. It's an N=1 world. We need to protect our own mitochondria first. Then when enough people get it, then things will change, because people need to understand that no federal government, no government agency, no grassroots effort is going to change what's going on in North America. Why? Because the entire economy is based on this. There's no way they're going to turn this off. So you know it, I know it. It's foolish to think anything else. So you know what that means? That means that you need to start to realize there is no box. You have to go outside the box. And that's the reason why some of the things I teach people now are becoming very mainstream.
Yeah, I like your thoughts on that. This is I have hope that somehow not that 5G can be stopped, but that better wireless communications or even wired communication can be applied. But how many decades is it going to take? I'm not sure. And I know that the economy, when you look at everything from the self-driving cars to all the new technologies, everything is so intertwined that I don't see that.
That's the reason why 5G is a problem, because if people don't know what 5G is, it's called the Internet of Things. It means that we're going to have trillions of RFID chips connected to the internet so that everything's talking to everything. That's the reason why the spectrum has to be so broad. And the key is, the more technology, every brand, anything that's called smart, will hook up online. And when I tell people this is truly the Matrix, it absolutely is. They'll be able to know everything you do at any hour of the day, at any time, because an electronic signature can be found. They can triangulate you from just about anything now. So when people begin to understand this, there are things you can do. People think this is hopeless. It's not hopeless. And I personally think, as I said to you before, I think the 5G is going to be good, because I think it's going to be obvious to the governments that this is where things have to stop. In other words, we may stop here and then make it safe. And I think it's going to happen faster than everybody thinks, because here's the thing I know about the United States. The population's already sick. And if we make them any sicker, the economy, even though it's based on technology, will go broke. And this is the reason why I know it's going to change. But do I also know that the crazy things that we're seeing in our world now are going to continue to escalate, and we're going to have people fight on social media and say, there's no way that this lady killed herself. Like, for example, I wasn't going to share this publicly, but I'm going to share it with you guys here, because you'll be shocked to hear this. So I did a consult for one of my very wealthy members in Mexico in December of 2017. So we're talking 6 months ago. His dad happens to own a lot of property on the Upper East Side, and his dad is a non-believer. He's a believer. So when I told this person what was going on the Upper East Side, he's like, no way. I said, oh yeah, they can't dig up the streets in Westchester County, upstate New York. Why? Because the people there have a lot of this, and they don't like construction around them. So guess what the solution was? AT&T and Verizon and several other carriers, Comcast, decided they were going to put 80 gigahertz, 120 gigahertz antennas on the buildings on Central Park West, Park Avenue, Fifth Avenue, and point them up to the Whitestone Bridge and up to Rye, New York, and deliver 5G that way. Guess where Kate Spade lives, Nick? In one of those buildings. She has an 80 gigahertz microwave antenna that's been operational for 18 months.
Nothing else to add. It's crazy.
Take a guess where Anthony Bourdain lived in New York. Same place.
Okay,
so guess what?
Oh my God.
So this is what I'm trying to tell you. I can tell you other stories. Like, there's a building on Madison Avenue that 2 years ago was wired with fiber optics. Every level. This was a realtor's building. One of the biggest realtors. Like, you watch Bravo TV, all those realtors in New York. This is one of the places they work.
Yeah.
The stupid realtor company decided to put a cell tower on every floor of the building. It was like 30 stories. The guy who supplied the fiber optics to the building told him he would never install what they're trying to do, that it'd be a biologic nightmare. So this building on Madison Avenue went live 18 months ago. Within 1 week, everybody called in sick because they had horrible headaches, vomiting, were sick. And guess what? The realtor called up the fiber optic guy and said, what did you do? And he said, no, not what did I do. what you did.
Yeah.
It's what you put on the end of my fiber optics that got everybody in the building sick. So knowing that this stuff is going on, Nick, now you can see why I pay attention to the tea leaves. Why? Because I've already seen the devastation that's coming. And these people were working on the same floor as a 4G, 5G microwave device. And the entire building was shut down in 1 week. So just realize that if you happen to live in a city like this, or you're a practitioner in this city, that you're going to have pretty good observations. Just keep your eyes wide open. Keep your ears open. Don't think it's not plausible, because it is. People are going to get sick with 5G. And it's going to be, you're going to see somebody's completely normal to have a brain tumor in a couple of months. That's going to happen. And it's not going to be uncommon. It's going to be much more common than we all want to know. And the thing is, if they show up in your office, you have to be cognizant of it. Doesn't mean you have to go out and tell everybody because you'll be afraid. You just have that one-to-one relationship with the patient. Say, look, the only way you're going to fix this problem is you have to get out of this environment. And that's really the key. It goes back to the story that I told you before, Nick. You got to be the wildebeest, man. You got to be the person that lives a dynamic life. See, wild animals get this intuitively, but we're zoo humans. We're no longer wild. We set our TPs down and we live inside 90% of the time. What you and I are doing right now, this is not what we're designed to do. We're designed to sit around a fire and, eat an animal that we just killed and have these kind of conversations. That's the difference. And most of us don't desire that type of lifestyle anymore. The problem is, because we don't desire it, we're starting to get hit with the collateral effects of the choices that we've made within the electromagnetic spectrum.
And Jack, if it were a nuclear leak, no one will be surprised that you're telling them to get out. It would be like, right. Of course, Fukushima. I mean, you don't go there. And yet,
well, the reason why is because everybody knows the ionizing story, but here's what people don't realize. The non-ionizing story is as bad, and we've known about it for a really long time. The problem is when the military and our government decided to change the economy from an agricultural economy to a service-based technology economy, I don't think they really believed that people would get this sick. If you look back from the time that we started radar installation after World War II because of the Japanese invasion, and look at all the disease curves, autism was not even on the planet at that time. Same thing with Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's just came to be in 1901. That was the first time it was ever described in the literature. That's 25 years after Edison's bulb, and it's 15 years after Tesla's AC grid that we still use today. And people don't realize how these things link. They want to blame it on GMOs. They want to blame it on food. They want to blame it on the things they understand, Nick, which goes back to my story. Don't blame it on stuff that isn't the cause. Like, it drives me crazy when I hear people tell people, oh, well, carbohydrates are really bad for you. No, they're not really bad for you. They're designed to be eaten when it's summertime. You know why they're really bad for you in a 0G to 5G world? Because all non-native EMF increase AMPK pathways, increase glucose. So guess what? It's like a double dip. That's the real reason why. And the reason why your body does it is what I told you before. You can't use the TCA cycle and urea cycle. You have to use the old pathways. That's the reason why your glucose goes through the roof. That's the reason why. It's because of the non-native EMF that we've built, that we're living in within our cities. That's the real problem.
And every time you disconnect yourself from nature and you add these artificial things, things tend to go south. And maybe one last thing, grounding. Grounding in nature, let's grounding in nature. No? Yeah. Yes?
No, I'll tell you why.
Not anymore.
No, not anymore. In a 0G to 4G world, the answer was absolutely. I was the biggest proponent. Here's the problem. Nick, if you take your shoes off in Montreal right now and there's a 5G antenna, you're going to get electrocuted.
Bad news.
Just remember what I told you, that most of our cities have their power, their gas lines, their sewer lines underneath the ground. So it's really been ineffective. In fact, in Vermont, you'd probably be shocked. I told one of my members this, who's from New York City. The only place that I told them that they can ground is in Strawberry Fields, where they have all the concerts. Do you know why? They've not been allowed to tunnel underneath there for utilities or the subways. That's the only place in New York City that I can tell you that you can ground safely. If you go above 81st and 5th or Central Park West, it's been completely tunneled. So you're taking a huge risk. And here's the irony. If you ever go to New York, you'll notice that all the humans tend to congregate at Strawberry Fields. Why? Because much like the wildebeest we talked about earlier, they kind of know that that area is a little bit safe, but they don't know why.
Yeah, and they feel different, but they don't know why. Yeah,
right.
that's interesting.
That's the key for you, because I know you live in a city. Most of the people that are probably listening to this are going to be in a big city. You just need to become aware. Start making friends with construction people who do like civil engineers. Get a friend in your network that's a civil engineer. They can teach you about these maps. I'm fortunate. I have members that do this. So just about every big city, I know where all the problems are. And that's the reason why I tell people, you do not want to go here. You do not want to go there. There's already places that, for my members, are off base. That you just, as soon as they come and they're new, I tell them, pull up your stuff. It's time to move. It just happened 2 weeks ago. I had a member call me from Colorado Springs. She sold their house. She's in Playa del Carmen right now. And she's a big software engineer for Oracle. She's got plenty of money, but she couldn't understand why she was 47 years old and she felt like she was going to die. And I said, well, it's pretty simple. You know where you live. You know what's going on. When I told her what was going on, she goes, I had no idea. And I said, she goes, I have all the devices. I said, yeah, they're not 5G compatible. And she goes, you're kidding me. I said, oh no, I'm dead serious. And when she's down there, she contacted me by text 2 days ago. She's like, I can't believe the difference in my life. I said, see that? It didn't take any supplement. It didn't take any functional medicine test. It didn't take anything at all, Nick. And see, this is the counterintuitive part of mitochondrial medicine. This is the reason why in a 5G world, the perspective needs to shift a little bit. And that's the reason why I teach people the details about how mitochondria really work, because guess what? You start to realize that those little wildebeests in nature, they're pretty smart. And nature built us with some pretty amazing things. The problem is we think we're too smart for our own britches. We don't realize that we've created our own natural disaster, and we're the stars of the show.
If the environment is clean, let's say I'm in Sherbrooke, I go to my parents, 2-hour drive from Montreal, and then I go to a friend's house. It's in a little town. There's 5,000 people maximum in the middle of the freaking forest. Can I use a grounding mat and have a spike in the ground?
I wouldn't use a grounding mat. I would just use the earth there. But that's one of the things that I think you probably did hear me say in Vermont, that I'm really happy for Vermont, because based on those 2 new papers that I talked about in Vermont, I actually think that you can do well in a place like Vermont now, even though it's a high latitude. Why? Because the population density is unbelievable. So I'm going to tell you that that's the top of my list right now until Elon Musk decides to do something different.
Yeah. Okay. So low population density, and if you're in the middle of a city, I mean, yeah, you're going to be extremely careful. Just trying.
You can't be careful. I'm just telling you, in the 5G world.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you are going to be the wildebeest that is crossing the Nile River every day when you get on the subway or drive your car.
It is survival, not thriving, right? That's living in a city is, and that's my reality. But it definitely makes me think. And there's no amount of I don't see like I think that in the functional medicine world, what's gonna happen is that people who live in a city are gonna start to have 20 to 25 to 35 supplements and 100 supplements, and they're like, wow, if I get on 99 supplements, I fall apart. 100, I'm good. And it's
Nick, this is the reason why I'm not a popular guy for all those people, because you know what? I'm the guy that tells you to throw it all in the garbage and do it a different way. Yeah. And guess what? The more people that follow me, you go talk to them. You had the opportunity to talk to 30 or 35 of them. Those people are doing really well. Why? Because when you understand nature and how she works, and you begin to swim with her waves, guess what? Your life can change. And really, that's the message that I hope begins to resonate, in your future work, your future books, your future, teaching people this kind of stuff, because these little nuances, I'd be the first one to admit, it's not convenient and it's not fun to think about. But here's the thing. life always finds a way. And I personally believe that we're getting ready to lose a lot of people very, very quickly. And it's going to happen in several decades. If we can get 70 to 100,000 people to really be on board and understand this, we can help a lot of people doing some pretty simple stuff.
Thanks, Jack. It's been amazing. What a great discussion. And I wanted to have you on to have a completely different perspective. This is nothing like the other interviews I had, and I'm that's exactly what I've gotten. So thank you so much, and I hope to have you back on to as things evolve. What I've decided for this course is to create a new course every freaking year. And why is that? Well, it evolves so fast that I want it to stay updated with everything that we discover. Maybe there's going to be a new 5G meter out for $1,000. I don't know, but we cannot teach functional medicine in a format that's like, oh, I'm going to teach you a module and then it's good for 10 years, especially not when it comes to environmental medicine.
Right. Now you know why I decided to put my roots down and build the facility that I'm building, because guess what? That's exactly what the facility is going to be about. It's going to be about the constant change and teaching people what to pay attention to next, because guess what? What we did 2 or 3 years ago may not be what we have to do in the future.
Right.
And it's also one of the things that hopefully now people who are out there who are food gurus begin to realize why I had such a big problem with the paleo people, because the way we ate 10,000 years ago has nothing to do with the 5G world. And that perspective alone should get you to think, hey, is this the reason why guys like Jimmy Moore are having the problem they're having? The answer is yes. And this perspective is so alien to that group that they won't understand it. I'm hoping that some of the people that you share this with, I don't want them to believe anything you and I said. But what I want them to do is be curious to say, you know what? I need to look at this a little bit deeper, because maybe I've left some fat on the bone and I can really help some people that are in my community that are looking for my help.
Totally. Great message. Great talking to you, Jack. And do you have anything to add as a conclusion for health practitioners, something that we haven't covered yet, or just mention your website?
Just don't give up. Go all in. Listen, the thing is, the reason everybody signed up to be a health practitioner is because they want to help people. If you really want to help people, you're going to have to embrace curiosity, and you have to realize the wounds that you've created, the wounds that your patients have, are going to become the wisdom for you to win on the other side. And do not be afraid. You have to charge and go all in. And I'm being very honest with you when I say this, Nick. That's the reason I am the way I am. I make no apologies for the way I am, because I realize that until people get this message loud and clear, both the public, the journalists, the people on TV, and the people that follow you on social media, they need to understand why they're in for the fight of their lives.
And your website, if people want to learn more about, especially about the science part, I think you go so deep. I try to keep up with the Patreon. Is that I know you have different membership levels. Talk about that for a sec.
Yeah, my website is jackkruse.com, and on there, those are where I teach people to become mitochondriacs. My real 5G stuff, because it's so clinically oriented, is now behind the Patreon site. And Patreon is www.patreon.com/Dr. Jack Kruse. Right now I'm in a new series called the Quantum Thermodynamics series. This basically is, if you're interested in 5G, this is the series that you want to listen to, because this is all the foundational stuff, exactly how we are going to connect and disconnect our biology by using this stuff. Once you understand this, then I have like real life examples. Like, for example, I'm getting ready to show people in the next week how a person that had a tattoo for 22 years, who worked in IT industry, came to see me for a back problem. And I looked at that tattoo and I said, I think that's a T-cell lymphoma. And she looked at me, she goes, there's no way. And she goes, I've had this for 22 years. I said, yeah, you've been in the basement of the hospital for the last 7 years as an IT person around blue light, non-native EMF. The red part of your tattoo has reacted. That tells me it's made out of cinnabar. Cinnabar is a stable compound of mercury, but it has a blue light resonance. Guess what, Nick? She got a biopsy. She got a T-cell lymphoma.
Wow.
So guess what? This is the point that I want to make. When you know better, you do better. You're able to tell people something and make predictions. And you remember what I said in the beginning of my talk in Vermont? What's the mark of a good theory? Is when it can make predictions and they start to come true. That's when people have to start to pay attention to you. And the key is you have a lot of people out there that are sick. That's the reason you're putting this seminar on. Well, it's our job to try to help them any way we can. Some of us are going to have different parts in this battle. My part is to teach people the basic science. A lot of people don't want to know it. That's fine. But I think once you jump down the rabbit hole, if I can learn it and knew zero about it in 2003, you can learn it too. There's no reason you can't. I've got hundreds of thousands of members that are learning it as we speak.
Thank you, Jack. Thanks so much. And well, have a great day. It's been amazing. And for everyone listening to that, because I'm gonna put this interview for free on YouTube. On top of being part of the membership for Electrosmog RX, well, if you want to learn about Electrosmog RX, it's simply electrosmogrx.com, and you'll learn everything about EMFs. And of course, this course will be updated every year. And I think that this interview has been really foundational, Jack. And I'll definitely a lot of food for thought in how the course is gonna develop. But thanks for your insights.
No problem. Anytime.
All right. Have a great day.
You too. Take care.
See ya.